Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, remains one of history's most tragic figures. Her brief life was marked by youthful beauty, scandalous rumors, and the ultimate betrayal that sealed her fate. This documentary unravels the story of a queen whose rise and fall embodied the perils of Tudor court politics. Early life and modest beginnings. Catherine Howard, born around 1523, entered the world as a member of one of England's most powerful noble families. Her father, Edmund Howard, was a younger son of the Duke of Norfolk, but his financial difficulties relegated the family to a modest existence. Despite her noble lineage, Catherine's upbringing was far from the grandeur associated with Tudor aristocracy. Her mother, Joyce Culpeper, passed away when Catherine was young, leaving her care to relatives. This familial arrangement profoundly influenced her development and future choices. Catherine's early years were spent in the household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The household was large and chaotic, filled with young women from noble families who were sent there for education and supervision. However, the Duchess was often preoccupied, and discipline was notably lax. This environment allowed Catherine to develop a lively and carefree personality, but it also exposed her to influences that would later haunt her. As a young girl, Catherine received little formal education. Unlike her contemporary queens, who were fluent in multiple languages and skilled in diplomacy, Catherine's instruction was limited. She learned basic reading and writing, along with household skills suitable for her future role as a wife. This lack of academic grounding would later contribute to her difficulties in navigating the political complexities of court life. During her adolescence, Catherine's exposure to courtly behavior and flirtation began in the household. The Dowager Duchess's home was known for its relaxed moral standards, with young women and men engaging in unsupervised interactions. Catherine, charming and vivacious, quickly attracted attention. She became romantically involved with Francis Dereham, a member of the household, in what appeared to be a youthful and consensual relationship. These experiences shaped her understanding of relationships, but they also left a trail of scandalous rumors. Although Catherine's family was well-connected, her father's precarious financial position meant she was not initially seen as a prominent figure. Her rise to prominence was unexpected and due in large part to her beauty and personality. Yet, her early exposure to the risks of courtly flirtation and the lack of mentorship would set a dangerous precedent. In an era when a woman's reputation was paramount, Catherine's youthful indiscretions would later resurface with devastating consequences. Catherine's early life demonstrates the stark contrast between her potential and the constraints imposed by her circumstances. Despite her noble blood, she faced a fragmented upbringing and limited opportunities. These factors made her both ambitious and vulnerable, qualities that would propel her to the heights of royal power, but also lead to her downfall. It was this combination of charm, ambition, and naivety that made Catherine an appealing yet tragic figure in Tudor history. Her modest beginnings were emblematic of many young women of her time, caught between familial expectations and societal constraints. Catherine Howard's story, however, would take a dramatically different path. As her life transitioned from the relative obscurity of her childhood to the glittering and perilous world of the Tudor court, her fate was sealed. The seeds of both her triumph and tragedy were sown during these formative years, shaping her into a figure both admired and pitted by history. Entering court life. Catherine Howard's life took a decisive turn in the late 1530s when she entered the court of Henry VIII. Her path to the center of power began when she was appointed as a lady-in-waiting to and of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife. This position, arranged by her powerful uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, thrust her into the Tudor court's volatile and glittering world. For a young woman of Catherine's charm and beauty, the court offered both opportunity and peril. At the time, Anne of Cleves struggled to gain favor with her husband, Henry VIII. Their union, born of political necessity rather than romantic inclination, was a failure from the outset. The king famously described Anne as lacking allure, and their marriage quickly became a source of tension. Amid this backdrop of discontent, Catherine's youthful energy and striking appearance stood out. She quickly became a favorite of courtiers and, more importantly, caught the attention of the king himself. Catherine's rise in the court was facilitated by the strategic ambitions of her family. The Howards were an influential faction, eager to regain prominence after a period of diminished influence. By placing Catherine in the Queen's household, they positioned her as a potential pawn in their broader political maneuvers. Catherine, however, seemed less interested in politics and more in enjoying the luxuries and attention that court life offered. Her vibrant personality and flirtatious demeanor captivated those around her, including the aging monarch. Henry VIII, nearing 50, was at a low point in his reign when he noticed Catherine. His health was declining, marked by a painful leg ulcer and frequent bouts of melancholy. The king sought solace in the company of a young, vivacious woman who could restore his vigor and pride. Catherine embodied the qualities he desired: beauty, youth, and an apparent innocence that contrasted sharply with his disillusionment in and of Cleves. This infatuation became the foundation of their ill-fated relationship. For Catherine, the attention of the king was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She had entered court life with limited preparation for the scrutiny and expectations that came with royal favor. Yet, her natural charm and lively disposition endeared her to Henry, who lavished her with gifts and tokens of affection. While Catherine may have seen this as an opportunity for advancement, she likely underestimated the political and personal stakes involved. The dynamics of the Tudor court played a crucial role in Catherine's rise. As a nexus of power, ambition, and intrigue, the court was rife with factions vying for influence. Catherine's sudden prominence placed her at the center of these struggles, with allies and rivals closely watching her every move. While she relished the attention, she was also navigating a dangerous landscape where missteps could be fatal. Catherine's appointment as a lady-in-waiting was a turning point, marking her transition from relative obscurity to the heights of royal favor. Her charm and beauty made her a natural star in the court's social sphere, but her naivety left her ill-equipped for the complexities of Tudor politics. The seeds of both her ascent and her eventual downfall were sown during this phase of her life. Her journey from courtier to queen would be swift and dramatic, reflecting both her personal allure and the perilous nature of Tudor court life. Henry's obsession with Catherine. Henry VIII's growing infatuation with Catherine Howard was as much a product of his personal insecurities as it was her undeniable charm. By 1540, Henry was an aging king, struggling with declining health, a failing marriage to and of Cleves, and the pressures of maintaining his legacy. Catherine, a 16-year-old bursting with youthful energy and radiance, offered him a tantalizing promise of rejuvenation. To the king, she was not only a beacon of vitality, but also a means of recapturing his lost sense of masculinity and power. Henry's attraction to Catherine was immediate and intense. He saw in her a stark contrast to and of Cleves, whose subdued demeanor and lack of physical appeal had left him cold. Catherine's flirtatious nature and effortless charm quickly made her the center of his attention. In a court where every gesture carried political weight, Catherine's ability to captivate the king was a powerful asset. Her presence seemed to reinvigorate Henry, whose mood visibly lifted whenever she was near. Catherine, for her part, appeared to relish the attention she received from the king. Having grown up in relative obscurity and without significant wealth, the lavish gifts and adoration from the most powerful man in England were undoubtedly intoxicating. Jewelry, fine gowns, and tokens of royal affection flowed her way, cementing her status as a royal favorite. However, Catherine's youth and inexperience made her blind to the deeper implications of Henry's obsession. What may have seemed like harmless flirtation carried enormous consequences within the rigid structures of Tudor court life. Henry's pursuit of Catherine was swift and decisive. Convinced that his marriage to and of Cleves was irreparably broken, he sought an annulment. The process was expedited by political machinations and Anne's own lack of resistance, clearing the way for Catherine to ascend to queenship. Within weeks of his annulment, Henry proposed to Catherine, and their union was celebrated with a quiet yet jubilant ceremony. For the king, this marriage was a declaration of renewed vitality and dominance, while for Catherine, it marked the pinnacle of her unexpected rise. The court buzzed with speculation and intrigue surrounding the match. Many were struck by the glaring age gap between the 49-year-old king and his teenage bride. While some viewed the union as a desperate attempt by Henry to prove his virility, others saw Catherine as a tool of Howard family ambition. Despite these whispers, the royal court presented a facade of celebration, eager to embrace the promise of a young queen who might secure the Tudor line. Beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic union lay the seeds of tension. Catherine, with her youthful exuberance, was unprepared for the demands of royal life and the scrutiny that came with being Henry's queen. Her natural flirtation, once an asset, began to raise eyebrows among courtiers, many of whom were already aware of her past romantic liaisons. For Henry, however, Catherine could do no wrong. Enchanted by her beauty and the illusion of purity, he remained oblivious to the growing undercurrents of scandal. The relationship between Henry and Catherine exemplified the contradictions of Tudor court life. Their marriage symbolized both the king's undying pursuit of personal satisfaction and the precarious position of a young woman thrust into the highest echelons of power. Catherine's role as Henry's fifth wife marked the beginning of a brief yet tumultuous chapter, one defined by passion, disillusionment, and the looming specter of betrayal. For now, the court basked in the glow of their new queen, unaware of the storm that lay ahead. A queen crowned. On July 28, 1540, Catherine Howard became the fifth wife of Henry VIII, crowned queen in a private ceremony that marked the culmination of her rapid ascent. The event, though more subdued than previous royal weddings, was celebrated as a moment of renewal for the aging king and his court. For Henry, the union symbolized a fresh start, imbued with hope for love, youthfulness, and perhaps another chance at securing a male heir. For Catherine, it was an unimaginable leap from her modest beginnings to the pinnacle of Tudor power. The weeks following their marriage were marked by displays of opulence and affection. Henry, eager to showcase his new bride, lavished her with expensive gifts, from elaborate jewels to richly embroidered gowns. He organized feasts and entertainments in her honor, presenting her as the centerpiece of his revitalized court. The queen's beauty and charisma drew admiration from many, though some whispered about the potential risks of her inexperience and youthful exuberance. Still, her ability to enchant both the king and the court cemented her initial success as queen. Catherine's early days as queen revealed her talents in courtly life. Though she lacked formal education and political training, she excelled in her role as a social figure. Her charm, warmth, and natural flair for hosting made her popular among courtiers. She breathed new life into court festivities, ensuring that banquets, dances, and hunts were lively and enjoyable. Her ability to distract Henry from his frequent health struggles added to her appeal, further solidifying her position. However, her rise to queenship was not without its challenges. Catherine's sudden prominence invited scrutiny, particularly from those who resented the Howard family's growing influence. The court, a hive of political rivalries, became rife with speculation about her suitability for the role. Her youthful behavior, which endeared her to Henry, was seen by others as a potential liability. Her lack of experience in state affairs made her vulnerable to manipulation, as she was reliant on advisors and family members for guidance. Despite these underlying tensions, Catherine appeared to enjoy her newfound role. She embraced the luxuries of queenship with enthusiasm, donning exquisite gowns and participating in elaborate ceremonies. She also showed genuine kindness to her ladies-in-waiting and attendants, earning the loyalty of those closest to her. Yet, beneath the surface of her seemingly idyllic life, danger loomed. Whispers of her past indiscretions began to resurface, threatening to unravel the carefully constructed image of the young queen. The queen's position became increasingly precarious as the initial glow of her marriage began to fade. Henry, though still enamored with Catherine, grew more irritable due to his ongoing health problems and political concerns. Catherine's vivaciousness, once her greatest asset, began to draw suspicion from factions within the court. Those who envied her family's influence quietly sought opportunities to expose her vulnerabilities. Catherine's coronation marked the beginning of a fleeting yet pivotal chapter in Tudor history. Her marriage to Henry VIII symbolized both the hopes of a rejuvenated monarchy and the fragility of life at court. As queen, she experienced the height of royal privilege but remained unaware of the forces conspiring against her. The crown she wore so brightly would soon become a burden, foreshadowing the dramatic unraveling of her brief reign. Catherine's character and influence. Catherine Howard's character and charm were central to her early success as queen, yet they also played a significant role in her eventual downfall. Her natural vivacity, warmth, and beauty made her one of the most captivating figures at the Tudor court. She had a remarkable ability to attract attention, not only from Henry VIII, but also from courtiers who were drawn to her youthful energy. Despite her relative inexperience, Catherine quickly established herself as a popular queen, beloved for her lively presence and her ability to lift the spirits of those around her. While her beauty and charm were undeniable, Catherine's lack of education and formal training became a stark contrast to the intelligence and political acumen of her predecessors. Unlike the politically savvy Anne Boleyn or the calculating Catherine of Aragon, Catherine's interests seemed to lie more in socializing and enjoying the luxurious lifestyle her position afforded her. The queen was not particularly involved in the governance of the kingdom or the complex religious reforms under Henry VIII's rule, leaving the political maneuvering to those around her. This lack of involvement in statecraft allowed others, especially her ambitious family, to exert significant influence over her actions. Catherine's uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, played a key role in advancing her position at court, using her marriage to Henry as a way to further his own political ambitions. However, Catherine's naivety and reliance on her family for guidance left her vulnerable to manipulation. Her relationships with those around her, particularly her advisors, were based more on personal charm than on political alliance, creating a dangerous imbalance in her courtly power. Though Catherine's beauty and charisma were her strongest assets, they also played into the narrative that she was a naive and somewhat frivolous figure. Her behavior, seen by some as overly flirtatious, raised eyebrows among courtiers who began to question her suitability as queen. Her interactions with men were particularly scrutinized, with whispers about her past relationships growing louder. Despite this, Henry remained utterly devoted to her, often dismissing rumors and viewing them as a threat to his own authority rather than a reflection of Catherine's conduct. Her influence over the king, especially in the early months of their marriage, was considerable. Catherine was able to soften Henry's harsh demeanor and lighten his mood with her youthful energy, which helped distract him from the issues plaguing his kingdom. However, as Henry's health continued to deteriorate, his need for emotional and physical reassurance grew, and Catherine, despite her charms, was unable to meet all of his increasingly demanding expectations. In the face of Henry's growing discontent, Catherine tried to maintain the image of an ideal queen, but the pressure of court life and the rumors surrounding her past were beginning to take their toll. Her reliance on her beauty and flirtatiousness, once assets, became sources of suspicion among those who saw them as signs of moral weakness or immaturity. As her popularity with Henry began to wane, Catherine's character became a point of contention, and her role at court began to shift from adored queen to vulnerable figure under scrutiny. Catherine Howard's time as queen exemplifies the challenges faced by a young, inexperienced woman thrust into the political and social maelstrom of Tudor court life. Her initial success was built on her ability to charm and entertain, yet her lack of political savvy and the growing resentment from her rivals exposed her weaknesses. Though she initially wielded influence over Henry, her reliance on charm rather than intellect left her exposed to the dangers of courtly intrigue and the harsh judgments of those who would see her fall. The secrets of Catherine's past. Though Catherine Howard appeared to be the very picture of innocence and youthful charm, her past was far from spotless. Beneath the glittering surface of her royal position lay a history of youthful indiscretions that would later haunt her and seal her tragic fate. Prior to her marriage to Henry VIII, Catherine had been romantically involved with several men, most notably Francis Dereham, a member of the Howard household, and Thomas Culpeper, a courtier at Henry's court. These relationships, though not unusual for a young woman of her social class, were to become the focal point of a scandal that would ultimately destroy her reputation. Catherine's relationship with Francis Dereham, which began when she was still in the care of her step-grandmother, was an open secret at the time. It was said to have been a passionate but relatively harmless affair, with the two exchanging intimate letters and making promises of marriage. However, after Catherine's elevation to the position of queen, these past relationships began to surface, and they were scrutinized with a severity that would be impossible for anyone to evade in the politically charged atmosphere of the Tudor court. When Catherine entered Henry's household, she and Dereham were no longer involved, but their previous relationship was known to several members of her household. Moreover, Derham had taken steps to position himself as a potential suitor for Catherine even after her marriage to the king, claiming that he had been promised to her in the past. This claim would later be a central piece of evidence in the charges against Catherine, and it would play a critical role in her downfall. Equally damaging was her affair with Thomas Culpeper, a young and handsome courtier who was a favorite of Henry VIII's, especially during the period of Catherine's queenship. Their mutual attraction was evident to the court, and whispers about their flirtation soon reached the ears of Henry, though he initially turned a blind eye. The couple was said to have engaged in private meetings, and there was even talk of a possible affair, which only deepened suspicions surrounding Catherine's loyalty and character. Despite her beauty and charm, Catherine's inability to distance herself from these past relationships and her apparent flirtation with Culpeper were seen as signs of moral weakness by those at court. Henry, who had been devoted to her in the early days of their marriage, began to notice her behavior more critically as his trust in her began to erode. The king's growing discontent would prove fatal for Catherine, as it was not just her indiscretions that were troubling, but her failure to properly manage the delicate balance of power in the court. The revelation of Catherine's past became a weapon wielded by her enemies, who sought to expose her vulnerabilities and discredit her as queen. The Howard family, once eager to use her marriage to advance their status, now found themselves in a precarious position, with the reputation of their young relative hanging in the balance. While Catherine's youthful indiscretions were not uncommon for a noblewoman of her time, the stakes were much higher when one's actions could be perceived as a threat to royal legitimacy. In the rigid world of the Tudor court, a queen's past could not be easily erased, and the rumors surrounding Catherine would soon take on a life of their own. The secrets of Catherine Howard's past set the stage for her downfall, as they became the basis for the charges of adultery and treason that would ultimately lead to her execution. Her personal history, once a series of innocent youthful mistakes, now became the scandal that would unravel her life and destroy the fragile reputation she had carefully crafted as queen. Her past, once hidden in the shadows of her rise to power, was now cast into the unforgiving light of Henry VIII's court, where loyalty and morality were paramount. Catherine's tragic flaw was not just her romantic missteps, but her failure to recognize the dangers posed by her past, a past that would come to define her tragic end. The growing discontent of Henry VIII. As Catherine Howard's past began to surface and whispers of her indiscretions grew louder, the relationship between her and Henry VIII began to deteriorate. At first, Henry remained infatuated with his young bride, but as the months passed, the king's increasing physical ailments and declining health, coupled with his suspicions about Catherine's fidelity, began to overshadow their marriage. Henry's trust, which had been the cornerstone of their union, slowly unraveled as he became more and more convinced that his queen was not as virtuous as he had once believed. Henry's growing disillusionment was not just fueled by his health problems, but also by his heightened jealousy and insecurity. Catherine's youthful exuberance, which had initially captivated him, now seemed reckless and immature, particularly as rumors of her flirtations with other men persisted. The most troubling aspect of this unraveling relationship was Henry's deepening belief that his young wife was unfaithful, a perception that would become the driving force behind his subsequent actions. Henry's suspicions were initially dismissed, but as more evidence began to emerge about Catherine's flirtations and past relationships, his anger became undeniable. The once sweet queen, who had been the object of his passion, was now viewed with increasing mistrust and suspicion. The king's advisors, who had initially supported Catherine's coronation, began to turn on her, whispering behind her back and sowing the seeds of doubt in Henry's mind. In 1541, after Henry had become aware of her past relationship with Frances Derham and her ongoing flirtations with Thomas Culpeper, he began to privately investigate the situation. The king's paranoia, long fueled by his previous wives' betrayals, intensified as he demanded answers from his inner circle and his agents. Catherine, unaware of the full extent of the king's suspicions, continued to carry on as though all was well, oblivious to the storm that was gathering around her. Meanwhile, her courtly rivals, many of whom were eager to see her fall, took full advantage of her increasing isolation and the unraveling of her reputation. Those close to Catherine began to abandon her, and her relationships with the men who once surrounded her became increasingly scrutinized. Catherine's youthful indiscretions, once seen as an afterthought, were now being used as damning evidence against her, and she began to sense the growing distance between her and the king. Catherine's position as queen, which had once seemed so secure, began to feel more like a fragile facade. As Henry's suspicions grew, so did the pressure on Catherine, who began to fear for her future. The love and attention she had once enjoyed from the king were replaced by cold suspicion and harsh interrogation. The tension between the royal couple reached its peak in 1542 when Catherine was arrested and accused of adultery and treason. Henry, now convinced that his young wife had betrayed him, was determined to see her punished for what he believed was a betrayal of their marriage and his authority. The once glamorous queen, who had captured the heart of the mighty monarch, was now trapped in a web of lies, deceit, and unforgiving court politics. Henry's discontent with Catherine was not just personal but also political. Her failure to meet his expectations and the allegations of infidelity provided the justification he needed to rid himself of his fifth wife and restore his own sense of control over the crown. This growing discontent, fed by suspicion and resentment, set the stage for a dramatic and tragic end to Catherine's brief reign as queen. In the end, Henry VIII's disillusionment with Catherine was a tragic reflection of his own emotional fragility, compounded by his deteriorating health and the political pressures that surrounded him. Catherine, once a symbol of youthful hope and vitality, had become a pawn in the ruthless game of Tudor politics, her fall from grace an inevitable consequence of her inability to navigate the dangerous waters of court life. The arrest of Catherine Howard. On November 7, 1541, Catherine Howard's fate took a sudden and irreversible turn when she was arrested on charges of adultery and treason. The arrest came after Henry VIII had become convinced that his young queen had betrayed him, not just through her previous relationships, but also with her ongoing flirtations and clandestine meetings with Thomas Culpeper, a courtier whom she was suspected of having an affair with while married to the king. This moment marked the beginning of Catherine's fall from the pinnacle of royal life to the grim reality of the Tower of London, where she would be confined to await her trial. The king's fury was sparked by the realization that Catherine had been unfaithful to him, an accusation that was not taken lightly in Tudor England. Adultery by a queen was a direct threat to the legitimacy of the throne, and accusations of treason were considered among the gravest of offenses. Henry, whose personal insecurities had always been amplified by his troubled marriages, saw Catherine's actions as an affront to his authority and the stability of his reign. His disillusionment with her would leave no room for mercy or negotiation. On the night of her arrest, Catherine was removed from her chambers in the royal palace and taken to the Tower of London, a place synonymous with imprisonment and execution for many of Henry's perceived enemies. Her family, initially supportive of her rise to queenship, were now conspicuously silent as the weight of the charges against her grew heavier. The Howard family, having once backed her marriage to the king as a way to increase their power, now found themselves implicated by the scandal surrounding her fall from grace. Catherine, though terrified, initially denied all charges, claiming that she had been manipulated by her past lovers and had never intended to harm the king. However, as the evidence against her mounted and the king's anger remained unwavering, her defenses began to crumble. The queen was interrogated by those closest to Henry, including Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was tasked with uncovering the full extent of her actions. The charges against Catherine were grave: adultery with Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham, as well as treason for her betrayal of the king's trust, each carrying the death sentence under the laws of the time. The proceedings were swift, as Henry, consumed by a need for justice, sought to rid himself of the woman he had once loved, believing her actions had tarnished both his reputation and his reign. Despite her young age and the circumstances of her past, Catherine's fate seemed sealed, as no one at court was willing to stand in her defense. The arrest of Catherine Howard not only marked the end of her queenship, but also sent shockwaves through the Tudor court. Her fall from grace was not just the result of her infidelity, but also a reflection of the ruthlessness of the court, where loyalty was everything and any perceived betrayal was punished with swift and often lethal retribution. Her arrest was the beginning of the end for Catherine, and her journey to the scaffold would only deepen the tragic narrative of her life. The speed with which Catherine was arrested and charged demonstrated the precarious nature of power at the Tudor court, especially for a woman like Catherine, who lacked the political savvy to navigate the complexities of royal life. Her imprisonment marked a turning point in her story, from a beloved and youthful queen to a convicted traitor, facing the wrath of a monarch who had once adored her. The trial of Catherine Howard. After her arrest, Catherine Howard was swiftly brought to trial, a court proceeding that would seal her fate. The trial, which began in December 1541, was both a public spectacle and a formal process of law, though the outcome had already been decided by those in power. Catherine, now stripped of her royal title and privileges, stood accused of adultery and treason, charges that were seen as unforgivable offenses against the crown. The trial took place in the midst of a tense atmosphere at court, where accusations of Catherine's infidelity had stirred the wrath of Henry VIII and his courtiers. It was clear from the outset that the proceedings would not be fair or impartial. Catherine had little hope of being acquitted, as the king's displeasure was already absolute. The court was made up of Henry's advisors, including Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who had long been involved in matters of church and state, and other members of the royal council. They were tasked with determining the extent of Catherine's betrayal and the consequences she would face. During the trial, Catherine was confronted with the evidence of her affairs, including her past relationship with Francis Dereham and her ongoing flirtation with Thomas Culpeper while she was queen. These acts were seen as direct insults to the king, as well as threats to the stability of the Tudor dynasty. Catherine, though deeply remorseful, could not deny the truth of these allegations, as much of the evidence was circumstantial and well known to the court. The prosecution made no attempt to soften the charges, and the Queen's defense was virtually non-existent. Throughout the trial, Catherine's youthful innocence and vulnerability were stark contrasts to the severity of the charges against her. She begged for mercy, explaining that she had been naive and manipulated by those around her, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Catherine's fate had been sealed not just by her actions, but by the political machinations of the court, where any mistake could be fatal for a woman in her position. The trial culminated in a verdict that was both swift and harsh. Catherine Howard was found guilty of adultery and treason, crimes that carried the death penalty. She was stripped of her title as queen and condemned to death by beheading, the same sentence that had befallen her cousin Anne Boleyn almost 5 years earlier. The court's treatment of Catherine during her trial was indicative of the political and social climate of Henry VIII's reign, where the line between personal and political life was often blurred. Though Catherine's actions were the catalyst for her downfall, her trial also demonstrated the extent to which women at court were at the mercy of their male counterparts, whose judgments were often final and unforgiving. Despite the overwhelming evidence against her, Catherine Howard's trial was still a tragedy of youth and misfortune. She was a young woman caught in the web of her own mistakes, but also the consequences of a system that offered little room for error. Her case was a grim reminder of the dangers of marrying into the royal family, where any slip could mean not just the loss of power, but life itself. As Catherine awaited her execution, the king, though still angered, did not wish to witness her suffering directly. Henry VIII had become accustomed to executing those who failed him, but Catherine's death would be different, more personal, as she had once been his beloved bride. For Henry, the trial and subsequent sentencing marked the final chapter of a doomed marriage, but it also illustrated the ultimate price of betrayal in the unforgiving world of Tudor politics. The fall of the Howard family. The scandal that enveloped Catherine Howard not only destroyed her, but also inflicted severe damage on her powerful family, the Howards, whose influence at court had been closely tied to her rise as queen. The Howards had been one of the most prestigious and influential families in England, particularly through their connections to the royal family, but Catherine's adultery and subsequent execution tarnished their reputation beyond repair. Once exalted for their loyalty to the crown and their wealth, the Howards now found themselves the target of the king's wrath, their future at court uncertain and fragile. Catherine's uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, had been instrumental in securing her marriage to Henry VIII, believing that her beauty and charm would elevate the family's status even further. Norfolk, a savvy and ambitious figure, had seen the union as a key to solidifying his political power. However, when Catherine's actions came to light, the consequences for Norfolk were immediate and severe. The king, who had once trusted Norfolk to manage the interests of his family, now saw him as an enabler of betrayal, and his political fortunes quickly began to unravel. Norfolk's influence was irreparably damaged. He found himself marginalized at court, with many of his allies distancing themselves from him out of fear that associating with the Howards could lead to their downfall as well. His position at court, once powerful and enviable, had become precarious, and it took years for him to regain some semblance of influence, though it was never to the extent it had been before Catherine's scandal. The damage to the Howard name extended beyond Norfolk. Other members of the family, who had been crucial players in the political dynamics of the Tudor court, were now relegated to the sidelines. The Howards' alliances with other powerful families began to falter, as no one wanted to risk being seen as too closely connected to the disgraced clan. Even after Norfolk's eventual return to favor, the Howards would always be haunted by the memory of Catherine's fall, and their name would never again hold the same sway at court. Catherine's betrayal had irrevocably altered the trajectory of the Howard family's legacy. Their connection to the throne, once a source of pride and prestige, was now a reminder of the fragility of power in the Tudor court. The family's hopes for further elevation through Catherine's marriage were dashed, and the political opportunities that might have arisen were lost. The story of the Howards' rise and fall serves as a poignant illustration of the dangers of courtly ambition and the often unpredictable consequences of one's actions in the volatile world of Tudor England. In the end, the Howard family was forced to retreat from the forefront of Tudor politics, their reputation forever tarnished by the scandal of Catherine's adultery. It was a devastating blow from which they would never fully recover. The rise and fall of the Howard family, like Catherine's own tragic tale, underscores the unpredictable nature of life at the Tudor court, where power could vanish as quickly as it was gained. Catherine's imprisonment in the Tower of London. After her arrest, Catherine Howard was taken to the infamous Tower of London, a place that would become synonymous with her tragic end. The Tower, a royal prison used for both imprisonment and execution, was where many of Henry VIII's enemies had met their final fate, and now it would be the site of Catherine's final days. The young queen, once full of life and ambition, was now a prisoner, her fate uncertain but increasingly grim as the charges against her became more undeniable. Catherine's confinement in the Tower was a stark contrast to her previous life of luxury and royal privilege. No longer the queen in her palace, she was now subject to the harsh realities of imprisonment, confined to cold, dark rooms with little comfort. Her once celebrated beauty and youthful vibrance seemed to fade as the weeks wore on, replaced by the weight of her impending doom. The nature of her imprisonment was severe. Catherine was denied any real freedom and was kept under constant watch by the guards and her keepers. She was not allowed to see anyone outside of her immediate family, and her once glamorous lifestyle had been reduced to the barest essentials of life as a prisoner. She was allowed no visits from friends or supporters, and the harshness of her confinement reflected the deep betrayal Henry VIII felt over her alleged actions. Despite her circumstances, Catherine clung to the hope that her innocence might be proven, though she knew the likelihood of her acquittal was slim. She was terrified, aware that the king's wrath had already been set in motion, and the charges against her carried the death sentence. Catherine's youth and naivete had failed her in the cruel and unforgiving world of the Tudor court, where political maneuvering and personal betrayal often led to tragic ends. Catherine spent her final days in the Tower in quiet despair, alone with her thoughts, fearing the inevitable verdict that was soon to come. Her family, once eager to bask in the glory of her royal marriage, now offered little support, as they too had been cast under the shadow of her scandal. The absence of any real advocates for her cause left Catherine isolated and vulnerable, a once powerful figure now entirely at the mercy of the king's decision. As the days dragged on, Catherine's fear and anxiety grew, knowing that her trial had already concluded and that there was little hope left for her survival. She was haunted by the thought of what awaited her and by the memories of the life she had once enjoyed, now forever out of reach. The Tower of London, a symbol of her fate, stood as a grim reminder of her fall from grace. Her imprisonment was not just a physical confinement, but also an emotional and psychological one. The stark contrast between her life as queen and her life as a prisoner seemed to illustrate the capriciousness of Tudor power, where loyalty could be so easily discarded, and where even the mightiest could fall from favor without warning. Catherine, once adored by Henry, was now a tragic figure in the annals of English history, and her time in the Tower would ultimately serve as a poignant prelude to her tragic execution. The execution of Catherine Howard. On February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard's tragic journey came to a devastating end as she was executed on charges of adultery and treason. The day began with a somber procession from the Tower of London to the scaffold at Tower Green, a site of execution reserved for nobility and those who had once held high rank. Catherine, despite her terror, tried to maintain a semblance of composure as she walked to her death, her mind clouded by the fear of what was to come. Before her execution, Catherine was allowed a final confession, during which she expressed her deep remorse for her actions and the betrayal she had committed against Henry VIII. She admitted to her adultery with Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham and pleaded for forgiveness from the king, though she knew it was too late. The public nature of her confession and the acceptance of her guilt were meant to show her contrition, but they did little to sway the king's wrath. The scaffold, where she was to meet her fate, was set up in full view of those assembled to witness the execution. The crowd, though sympathetic to the young queen's plight, was aware of the seriousness of the charges against her and the political necessity of her death. Catherine, now in her early 20s, had once been a beautiful and beloved queen, but in the eyes of Henry VIII, she had become a symbol of betrayal and disloyalty. Catherine's execution was swift. After a brief prayer, she knelt before the executioner and, according to some accounts, begged for mercy, though it was clear that no such mercy would be forthcoming. Her beheading was quick, and her death marked the tragic end of a young woman who had once been the shining hope of the Tudor court. Her execution, though brutal, was not unusual for the time. Henry VIII had already executed 2 of his wives, and Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon's close friend, and Boleyn's fate had been sealed in a similarly swift and unforgiving manner. Catherine Howard's death was another chapter in the king's troubled history of marital betrayals and the relentless pursuit of loyalty at any cost. As news of Catherine's execution spread, it further solidified the tragic and unstable nature of life at the Tudor court, where no one, not even the queen, was immune from the king's disfavor. Her death was not just the end of her life, but also the closing of another chapter in the volatile history of Henry VIII's marriages. Though Catherine Howard was gone, her story would not be forgotten. Her tragic end serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of navigating court politics, especially for those who lacked the experience and foresight to understand the ruthless machinations at play. The memory of Catherine's rise to power, her youthful innocence, and her tragic downfall would haunt the Tudor court for years to come, leaving a legacy that would be remembered for its bittersweet sorrow. Her execution, like those of Anne Boleyn and others before her, reinforced the harsh realities of Tudor rule, where loyalty was demanded at all costs, and any perceived betrayal was punished without mercy. Catherine Howard's fate, sealed by her own youthful indiscretions and the unforgiving hand of Henry VIII, marked the tragic end of one of the most poignant chapters in the history of the English monarchy. The legacy of Catherine Howard. Though her life was short and tragic, Catherine Howard's story would be remembered as one of the most poignant tales of the Tudor dynasty. Her brief reign as queen, marked by beauty and scandal, left a lasting impression on the court and on history itself. Catherine's tragic end brought to light the ruthless nature of Tudor politics, where the line between love and betrayal could easily blur, and where a woman's fate was often determined by the whims of a king. Catherine's downfall highlighted the precarious nature of royal women's positions in Tudor England. While many were in awe of the queen's beauty and youthful energy, Catherine lacked the political savvy and experience to navigate the treacherous waters of court life, where any misstep could lead to disaster. Her inability to recognize the dangers of her own relationships and actions ultimately led to her execution, and her story became a cautionary tale for those who followed her. The tragic arc of Catherine's life also revealed the ever-present power struggles within the Tudor court, where factions constantly shifted and the most powerful figures were those who could best manipulate the king's favor. Henry VIII's shifting moods, his insecurities, and his insatiable need for loyalty created a volatile environment in which Catherine, despite her innocence and youth, was unable to survive. The king's temperamental nature left little room for compassion, and Catherine's youth and beauty were no protection against the king's suspicions of betrayal. Catherine's death also had long-lasting consequences for her family, the Howards, whose fortunes had been tied to her success. The scandal surrounding her adultery and subsequent execution damaged their reputation irreparably, making it difficult for them to regain the influence they once enjoyed at court. The Howards were forced into political retreat, and their association with Catherine's downfall led to a tarnished legacy that would linger for generations. For Henry VIII, Catherine's execution was yet another painful chapter in his tumultuous marital history, reinforcing his belief in the necessity of absolute loyalty from those closest to him. Her death, though it may have brought him momentary satisfaction, did little to alleviate the deep sense of betrayal he felt throughout his reign, which had been marked by political and personal strife. Catherine's story was ultimately another tragic reminder of the fragility of royal marriages, where power, politics, and suspicion could destroy the most promising of unions. In popular culture and history, Catherine Howard's life and death would continue to spark interest and empathy, as her story is one of lost innocence, manipulation, and ultimately, death at a young age. She was remembered not just for her beauty, but for the way she became entangled in the dangerous web of Tudor politics, where she was ultimately crushed by forces far beyond her control. Catherine's name would remain linked with tragedy, but also with the complexities of Tudor court life, where the consequences of betrayal were swift and unforgiving. As history unfolded, Catherine Howard's legacy would be preserved not just as the tale of a beautiful young queen who had been loved and betrayed by her king, but also as a stark symbol of the dangers faced by royal women in the 16th century. Her life and death remind us of the fleeting nature of power and the precarious position of women in royal courts, where loyalty and virtue were often the price for survival. Catherine Howard may have been forgotten by the king who once adored her, but her story lives on as a lasting testament to the dangers of ambition, love, and betrayal in the world of Tudor England. Catherine Howard in historical memory. The tragic story of Catherine Howard has continued to capture the imagination of historians, writers, and the public alike, securing her place in the narrative of the Tudor dynasty. Though her life was brief, her downfall provides a vivid and poignant glimpse into the complexities of royal life in 16th century England. Catherine's youthful innocence and beauty, coupled with the brutal betrayal that led to her execution, have made her one of the most tragic figures in English history. Catherine's legacy has often been framed within the context of Henry VIII's many marriages, each of which bore its own unique story of love, power, and betrayal. Her execution at the hands of the king is remembered not only as a reflection of his increasingly ruthless approach to governance, but also as a stark reminder of the dangers faced by women in royal courts, where personal mistakes could lead to devastating political consequences. Her youth and naivety have often been highlighted as key elements in her tragic demise, as she was ultimately swept up in the dangerous politics of the Tudor court, unable to navigate its labyrinthine intrigues. The image of Catherine Howard as the innocent queen has been an enduring aspect of her legacy. Writers and historians have often portrayed her as a victim of her own beauty and youth, taken advantage of by men like Culpeper and Derham, and ultimately abandoned by her family at a time when she needed them most. Her inability to understand the weight of her actions in the context of her marriage to Henry VIII speaks to the limited agency women had in the royal court, where the political interests of the king often outweighed personal desires or moral considerations. Yet, Catherine's story also sheds light on the intricacies of Tudor politics, where betrayal and loyalty were often intertwined, and the fate of those who dared to defy the king was sealed with little mercy. Her execution at the Tower of London, a location that had already witnessed the deaths of other royal figures, served as a grim reminder of the cost of disloyalty during Henry's reign. The nature of her death, swift, impersonal, and politically motivated, underscored the fragile balance between personal lives and the politics of power. Despite the tragedy of her end, Catherine Howard's place in history is not simply one of victimhood. In a broader sense, she represents the volatility and impermanence of power in the Tudor court. Her life and death underscore the dangers of courtly life, where even the most beloved figures could quickly become dispensable if they were deemed a threat to the throne. Catherine's downfall stands as a cautionary tale, reminding future generations of the fragility of royal favor and the high cost of perceived betrayal. Historians have continued to examine her life, often focusing on her relationships and the political dynamics that contributed to her tragic end. Catherine's rise from a noble family to the Queen of England is an extraordinary story of ambition and opportunity, yet her downfall illustrates how fragile such advancements could be in a court dominated by an unpredictable monarch like Henry VIII. The fact that her death was seen as a necessary political act by Henry further exemplifies the harsh realities of life at the Tudor court, where personal lives were often sacrificed for the stability of the monarchy. In modern portrayals, Catherine Howard has often been depicted as a romantic figure, a young, beautiful queen caught in the unforgiving web of power and court politics. Her tragic story has inspired countless books, films, and television series, ensuring that her legacy endures in the cultural consciousness. Though her life was cut short, Catherine's tale remains a powerful reminder of the intersection of love, betrayal, and politics in one of England's most turbulent eras. The legacy of Catherine Howard is not merely the tragic tale of a queen lost to betrayal, but also a symbol of the precariousness of royal life, especially for women at the mercy of powerful men. Through her story, the complexities of Tudor court politics continue to resonate in the historical memory of the English monarchy. Reflections on Catherine Howard's tragic end. Catherine Howard's tragic death at the hands of Henry VIII serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers and complexities of Tudor court life. Her story, marked by youthful beauty, betrayal, and swift retribution, continues to resonate throughout history as a cautionary tale of the perilous nature of royal power. Catherine's execution was not just the end of her life, but the final chapter in a larger narrative about the dangers of ambition, loyalty, and trust in a volatile monarchy. The events surrounding Catherine's life and death underscore the extent to which royal women in Tudor England were at the mercy of their husbands and the court's shifting loyalties. Despite her royal status, Catherine was unable to navigate the intricacies of Tudor politics, where loyalty to the king was paramount. Her youthful misjudgment and inability to recognize the consequences of her actions led her to be branded as a traitor, despite the fact that many saw her as a pawn in a larger political game. The king's absolute power left little room for personal redemption. Though Catherine attempted to plead for forgiveness and express her contrition, her fate was sealed by the rigid demands of Tudor loyalty. Henry VIII's own paranoia and volatile temper had already sealed the fate of his fifth wife, and Catherine's fate, like those of Anne Boleyn and other royal figures before her, highlights the unrelenting nature of Tudor justice. Her death at Tower Green, a royal execution site, was not just the end of her life, but also the end of her hopes for a future beyond her marriage to Henry VIII. Catherine's tragic demise serves as a reminder of how fleeting royal favor could be, and how easily even the most adored could fall out of grace. The ruthless nature of Tudor politics left Catherine with little chance of survival once her infidelity was discovered, and her eventual execution underscores the fatal consequences of being caught in the web of courtly intrigue. Yet, despite her tragic end, Catherine Howard's legacy has lived on. She has been remembered not just for her beauty and her role as the Queen of Henry VIII, but as a symbol of the dangers faced by women in royal courts, where personal desires and ambitions often collided with the demands of political survival. Catherine's story continues to captivate historians and the public, offering lessons about the perilous nature of loyalty, trust, and power within the world of Tudor England. Catherine Howard's tragic end reminds us that in the ruthless world of Henry VIII's court, no one, not even a queen, was safe from the demands of loyalty and the unforgiving nature of Tudor politics. Her story, while a tragedy, is a powerful reflection of the dangers of ambition and betrayal in a world where power could change in an instant, and where the price of failure was often death. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.